Pennsylvania loves to sell you the postcard version. Rolling hills in the fall, small-town diners, old stone bridges, and that steel and sports grit that feels unbreakable. But behind that familiar image is 10 most abandoned cities in Pennsylvania. Places that didn't just fade, they got cut out. A whole community swallowed by rail yards and industry, erased so clean you can't even find a main street anymore. Forest trails that suddenly reveal a town's foundations, like ghost footprints. And the most disturbing one of all because it isn't quiet by choice. It's been burning underneath since 1962, so lean in, turn the volume up, and step into a Pennsylvania they don't put on the brochure. Number 10, Instanter, Elk County. There is a place in Pennsylvania that only exists when the lake decides to confess. Most days you can stand at East Branch Lake and see nothing but calm water, trees, and that innocent weekend quiet. But in a dry year, when the shoreline pulls back, a town starts to reappear piece by piece, like Pennsylvania's own Atlantis. Instanter was not a legend, it was a working settlement, tucked into the valley, a railroad stop and a tannery town that lived on timber, hides, and routine. In the 1890s, a tannery opened and gave the place a reason to wake up every morning. Families built lives around steady shifts and the smell of industry. Then the first warning hit. By the late 1920s, the tannery shut down for good, the local rail line ran its final trip, and the streets went quiet. That is the part people forget. Because the way Instanter really disappeared was even stranger. Then came the decision that erased it. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, engineers built the East Branch Dam to control flooding. The valley had a price, and Instanter paid it. When the dam was completed in 1952, the water rose and swallowed what remained. Roads disappeared under a new shoreline. Foundations became the lake bed. A community turned into a rumor you could only point to on an old map. And here is the eerie hook. When drought hits hard, the lake can fall by more than 50 feet and the bones of the town come back into view. You walk out onto mud that looks like ordinary ground until you notice straight lines that nature does not draw. Concrete slabs, rusted nails, broken brick, soft wood that crumbles at a touch. It is not a haunted house, it is something colder, proof that real lives were built here then edited out of the landscape. One former resident described the site as unsettling because the places that shaped her childhood were suddenly visible, but still unreachable, like a memory you cannot step back into. Locals have even called the reservoir the Dead Sea of Elk County, which sounds like a joke until you remember what is underneath it. Most of the time you can only guess what lies down there, unless you are a diver. Then for a brief window, the lake drops, and everyone gets a peek. So if you ever hear someone say a town vanished without a trace, ask one question. Did it vanish, or is it just waiting under the water? Next, the story changes. The next place was built to last and still ended up empty. Number 9, Concrete City, Nanticoke, Luzerne County. This is the kind of place that looks less like a town and more like an experiment someone forgot to shut down. Picture a perfect square of identical concrete duplexes lined up with eerie symmetry, as if a giant stamp pressed the same house into the ground 20 times. And here's the detail that makes people lean closer. When the owners wanted it gone, they tried dynamite. It barely worked. Concrete City was built in 1911 by the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad to house workers near the Truesdale Colliery. They pitched it like a promise, even calling it the Garden City of the Anthracite region. This was supposed to be modern worker housing, built to last, built to impress. The layout was precise. 20 double houses, 40 family units, all facing inward like a controlled little world. And it was not just rows of shelter. It had electric streetlights, sidewalks, a playground, a baseball field, tennis courts, and even a concrete swimming pool right at the center, as if the future had moved into coal country. But the future, it turns out, can feel miserable. Concrete sounded like progress until people tried to live inside it. Residents complained about constant dampness, walls that sweated and cold that seeped into everything. Some accounts describe winters so harsh that clothing could freeze solid inside a closet. The homes also relied on concrete outhouses behind the units, a detail that suddenly makes all the Garden City marketing sound like a joke. Within just 13 years, by 1924, the neighborhood was already fading into silence. Then the ownership changed hands, and the new company did not want a strange little concrete village sitting there empty. So they tried to remove it. One house was loaded with 100 sticks of dynamite. The blast went off, and the building largely stayed standing. That is the moment Concrete City becomes more than a ghost place. It becomes a stubborn monument to an idea that went wrong. A neighborhood that refuses to collapse even when someone pays to make it collapse. Over time, the empty houses became a magnet for curiosity. People came to walk the square, to take photos, to stare through dark windows and imagine the sound of families that once filled these rooms. At one point, the site even served as a training ground, the kind of place where crews could practice responding to emergencies in a setting that already felt like a scene from another world. Concrete City is not hidden underwater like a lost town. It is right there, above ground, in plain sight. A reminder that sometimes a community does not die because the land runs out or the mine closes. Sometimes it dies because someone tried to build the future out of the wrong material. And the next place on our list proves something even stranger. Not everything abandoned looks broken. Sometimes it looks almost beautiful. Number 8, Port Perry, Allegheny County, right near Braddock. Some abandoned places fall apart slowly, like a house that nobody bothers to repair. Port Perry is different. Port Perry didn't crumble. It got replaced. Not by nature, not by fire, not by time. By rail lines, steel, and the kind of industrial success that takes one look at a neighborhood and says, this ground is more valuable as a machine. If you rewind far enough, Port Perry started as a river town at the mouth of Turtle Creek on the Monongahela. In the late 1700s, it was pitched like a gateway, a convenient landing place, the kind of spot you would circle on a map and say, this is where trade is going to happen. Then the infrastructure arrived, and with it came momentum. Locks and dams made the river more reliable. Rail connections tightened the knot between the valley and Pittsburgh. Port Perry wasn't isolated, it was plugged in. And that was the problem. Because once the steel era roared to life, the map around Port Perry began to change shape. The Edgar Thomson Works rose nearby, and suddenly the town's biggest advantage became its biggest curse. A small community sat next to an operation that needed space, access, and constant movement. Steel doesn't just need workers, it needs corridors, it needs staging ground, it needs tracks that fan out like veins. Bit by bit, Port Perry's livable land became usable land, and those are not the same thing. Imagine standing there in the early 1900s. You are not looking at a sleepy riverside neighborhood. You are looking at an industrial panorama. Bridges, pipelines, coal piles, rail yards, and the hard geometry of an economy that never sleeps. The air feels metallic. The river is busy. The ground trembles in your chest when trains roll through. It's the kind of place where the noise becomes normal, until one day you realize the noise is all that's left. Yet, here's the haunting part for a video like this. If you go looking for Port Perry today, you don't get the typical ghost town reward of empty porches and broken windows. You get something stranger, the sensation that you're standing on top of a town that has been paved over by purpose. The streets didn't rot. They got erased. By the mid-1940s, the last traces were being cleared out, and Port Perry slipped from place people love into place trains pass through. Local stories painted as a rough and ready town in its prime, packed tighter than you'd expect, with a reputation for having more saloons than a place that size had any business supporting. Whether that number is exact or exaggerated, the vibe is the point. This was not a blank spot on a map. It was loud, human, and alive. Port Perry proves a chilling idea. Sometimes the most abandoned places aren't the ones that look ruined. They're the ones that look functional because the town is gone, but the machine is still running. Next, The story shifts again because the next place on our list wasn't swallowed by industry. It was swallowed by something you can't even stand on. Number 7, Yellow Dog Village near Worthington in Armstrong County. If you have never heard of it, the name alone is enough to make you stop and squint. Yellow Dog, it sounds like a nickname you pick up in a bar and never live down. But this place earned its name from something colder than a joke. It was tied to an old kind of deal meant to keep workers quiet, a bargain that said you can have better pay and a roof over your head as long as you stay away from unions. People called that kind of agreement a yellow dog contract, and in time the town wore the label like a scar. Yellow Dog Village began as a company community built close to the limestone work in the area because getting in and out was never simple. It was small, but it was real, not a myth, not a movie set. Accounts describe a compact cluster of housing, including duplexes, a manager's home, and a boarding house for workers who did not have families with them. You can still imagine the rhythm of it, the shift changes, the boots on dirt, the same faces passing the same porches every day. Then the industry that fed it started to fade. By the 1950s, the quarry operation in the area shut down, and the town's reason for existing began to evaporate. That is how most places die, slowly and predictably. Jobs disappear, people follow the next paycheck, and the buildings get quieter each year. But Yellow Dog did not fully disappear back then. A few residents held on for decades, long after the paycheck stopped, and that is what makes this place feel different. This is not just an old mining-era ghost town. It is a town that stayed alive far too long for comfort, like a candle refusing to go out. Then came the final problem. And it was not economics, it was water. In the early 2010s, reports say the village was finally abandoned when the water supply failed, and concerns about contamination forced the last people out. Think about that. A place can survive the loss of work. It can survive isolation. It can survive being forgotten. But it cannot survive when the tap stops being safe. And when you walk through what is left, the unsettling part is how recent it feels. This is not one of those ruins that have been picked clean by time. Stories from explorers describe personal belongings still inside, everyday objects that suggest someone lived here not that long ago. The kind of details that make you lower your voice without realizing you are doing it, because suddenly it feels less like history and more like interruption. Yellow Dog Village is a reminder that abandonment is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is administrative. Sometimes it is a test result. One day you are still home, and the next day you are told you cannot stay. So the next time you hear a ghost town name that sounds almost funny, remember this place. In Yellow Dog, the name was never a joke, and the silence it left behind is the part that sticks. Next, we head to a place where people did not leave because the town lost its purpose. They left because the land itself was claimed by something bigger. Number 6, Alvira, Union County, near Allenwood. Some places become ghost towns because people leave. Alvira became a ghost town because the government arrived and the town was simply removed. Not slowly, not naturally. It was taken off the map during World War II and replaced with something that was never meant to feel human again. Before the war, Alvira was a small rural community, the kind of place built around farms, families, and a few familiar roads. Then the War Department stepped in, and the land was seized. Homes were torn down, a church was dismantled, the town's rhythm ended, and in its place, the valley became part of the war machine. Locals say the work was treated like a secret, and the secrecy wasn't subtle. Workers were brought in on buses with the windows covered, dropped at specific stations, and sent home the same way, keeping everyone separated so nobody knew the whole picture. In a town like that, silence is not just quiet, it's enforced. The facility here was tied to wartime production and storage, including TNT, and when the war ended, the town never came back. Time moved on, and the land around it changed identities again. Nearby, the federal prison complex at Allenwood rose behind fencing. Around it, the woods became state game lands. And if you drive down Alvira Road today, you will find the reason this place feels like a story from another world. Hidden among the trees are dozens of concrete domes, squat and thick, like giant igloos built for something other than winter. These are storage bunkers, arranged so neatly it almost looks deliberate in a way that makes your skin tighten. Some are sealed, some are open, and their size is hard to appreciate until you stand close. One account describes them at roughly 44 feet across and about 24 feet tall, built so that if something went wrong inside, pressure would move upward rather than outward. That's a comforting engineering sentence until you remember what kind of something they were designed for. Walk into one of the open bunkers and the temperature seems to drop. The light disappears fast. The air feels still. One visitor described the inside as strangely dead, even acoustically, because the floor was thick with dry grass and debris that swallowed sound instead of reflecting it. No echo, no lively bounce, just a dull hush, as if the room refuses to speak back. And then you notice what makes Alvira more unsettling than a normal abandoned site. You can still find traces of the town that came first. A cemetery remains with family names that outlasted the buildings. There are spots where foundations linger, and the outline of what used to be ordinary life sits uncomfortably close to fences and warning signs from the newer world that replaced it. Alvira is a place with layers, and none of them feel peaceful. A town turned into a secret turned into concrete igloos in the woods. And the woods kept the memory, even when the map did not. Next, we head to a place where a town didn't get erased by war. It got erased by water. Number 5. Aitch, Raystown Lake, Huntingdon County. There is a boat launch here with a strange name, and most people glide past it without realizing it is the last public sign that an entire town ever existed. Aitch, not a word, not a person, just a sound, like a breath. And that is fitting because this place was taken quietly, not by crime, not by collapse, but by water rising on schedule. Aitch was a small railroad community tied to the Huntingdon and Broad Top Mountain Railroad. It was never a big dot on the map, more like a cluster of lives. Around 20 families, a general store, a post office, the kind of place where everyone knew whose truck was pulling in before it even stopped. And the name has an oddly personal origin. Locals say H came from the first letters of early settler names stitched together into one strange little label. It sounds almost playful until you understand how the town disappeared. Raystown Lake is not a natural lake, it is engineered. It's built and managed for flood control, recreation, and water management. And when it was created, the valley had to be cleared, reshaped, and surrendered. Over time, homes were moved to higher ground near Markelsburg, and the low-lying parts were prepared for the water that would eventually cover them. That is what makes Aitch different from the other places on this list. People didn't slowly drift away, they had a deadline. Now Aitch lives as a rumor that refuses to die. Ask around and you will hear the same line repeated like campfire lore. There is a whole town sitting under the surface, perfectly preserved, waiting for divers to explore. It sounds irresistible. It sounds like the kind of secret you would drive hours to see. But rangers and locals have pushed back on that image. The idea of a neat, intact neighborhood under the lake is more fantasy than fact. The area was cleared, the houses were moved, and the water took what was left. But that doesn't mean there is nothing down there. Under the lake are remnants, scattered traces that still make people uneasy because they are real. There are deeper structures tied to older infrastructure in the valley. And at certain depths, this is not casual exploration territory. Even modern work on the dam has required professional divers operating at serious depths. That detail alone changes how you look at a calm summer lake. Because once you know how deep it gets, the surface stops feeling friendly. It starts feeling like a lid. And then there are the stories people tell because they need a story. Raystown has its own lake monster legend, the kind of tale that keeps kids quiet around a campfire. It is easy to laugh at it, but the lake does not need a creature to feel haunted. The haunting is built in. Aitch is the reminder that a place can be erased without a fight, without ruins, without a single abandoned street to walk down. You can stand there today, hearing boat trailers clank and kids shout, and never realize the ground under the water used to be someone's front yard. Next, we move from a town taken by water to a town taken for a different kind of protection, where sacrifice was written into the blueprint. Number 4. Livermore, Westmoreland County. This is one of those places where the most haunting thing isn't what you can see, it's what you can't. Because Livermore didn't fade away the way a coal town does. It was cleared out, torn down, and sacrificed, so the river downstream wouldn't take something bigger. Livermore dates back to the early 1800s, a small river community that grew in the shadow of Pennsylvania's early transportation corridors. It sat in a valley that felt permanent, the kind of place you assume will always be there, because the river is always there. And there's an oddly famous footnote to prove it wasn't just a nameless dot on the map. In 1842, Charles Dickens passed through this area during his American travels, and he described his overnight stop as primitive. A tiny detail, but it pulls Livermore out of the fog and reminds you it had a real presence. Then came the flood history that shaped everything. In March of 1936, the region was hit by the St. Patrick's Day flood, one of the most destructive flooding events in Pennsylvania's history. The water rose fast and hard, chewing through river towns and forcing people into desperate decisions just to get through the night. Stories from the area describe residents clinging to rooftops as the current moved below them. After events like that, the valley stopped feeling permanent. It started feeling like a threat. That disaster fed a new era of engineering. Flood control became a promise, and in the early 1950s, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers completed the Conemaugh Dam and created Conemaugh River Lake. The mission was blunt: hold back water during major storms, so Pittsburgh and other downstream communities wouldn't drown. The dam was built to be a shield, and Livermore ended up behind that shield, inside the space that would be allowed to fill. So the town was emptied, buildings were condemned, homes were demolished, roads were cut. In the end, Livermore didn't get a slow goodbye. It got a clean one. Today, much of where the town once sat is part of the lake's pool area, and when the water is calm, it's easy to forget a community used to stand there. But one piece of Livermore still pulls people in: the cemetery on the hill. It's the kind of place that attracts rumors like a magnet. Some locals even connect it to zombie movie lore because Western Pennsylvania is famous for that kind of cinematic history. But the truth is more grounded, and somehow that makes it creepier. The cemetery isn't famous because of a film crew. It's famous because it's what's left when everything else is gone. A set of names on stone above a valley that was redesigned. And that's the strange logic of Livermore. The town was erased to protect other towns. The loss was intentional, written into a blueprint. The lake looks peaceful now, but it's peace created by absence. And next, we move to a place that didn't get cleared for a dam or swallowed by industry. It blew up with opportunity and collapsed even faster. Number 3. Rausch Gap, Lebanon County. This is one of the creepiest kinds of abandoned places because you don't drive into it. You walk into it. One moment you're hiking through thick Pennsylvania woods following the Appalachian Trail, listening to wind and water, and the next moment, the ground starts showing you straight lines that nature doesn't make. Stone foundations, old terraces, a town that looks like it was unplugged and left to dissolve into the forest. Rausch Gap sat in what was once called the Stony Valley, a rugged stretch of land tucked against Sharp Mountain, where Rausch Creek cuts through the trees. In the early to mid-1800s, this was not a peaceful hiking destination. It was an industrial valley built around anthracite coal and the rail lines that made coal worth anything at all. By the time the town hit its peak around the 1860s, Rausch Gap had roughly 1,000 residents. That might not sound huge today, but in a narrow mountain valley, it was a full community. Workers, families, a daily routine that only makes sense when the trains keep coming. And that's the key to this town's entire life story. Rausch Gap didn't exist on its own. It existed because it sat at the center of a railroad operation. Company offices were here, repair and machine shops were here, the town had a heartbeat, and it was made of steel wheels and schedules. Then in 1872, the railroad packed up its most important pieces and moved them to Pine Grove. That one decision did what fires and floods couldn't do. It took away the reason people stayed. Without the shops and the offices, the town stopped being a hub and became a leftover. Within just a few years, the population crashed. The valley got quieter, homes were dismantled, families moved out. By the time the early 1900s arrived, the place was already more memory than map. What makes Rausch Gap so unsettling today is how clean the disappearance feels. You don't see a dramatic skyline of ruins. You see clues, foundations that look like the outlines of rooms, stones that once held walls straight, small cemetery nearby where names remain even though the houses are gone. It creates a strange feeling in your chest, like you're standing on top of someone else's normal day. There's also something uniquely eerie about the way people experience it now. The Appalachian Trail runs right through this ghost landscape, and there's even a shelter nearby for hikers. That means you can sleep in the woods, wake up, and walk past the remains of a town that once held 1,000 lives. No ticket booth, no fence, just history scattered in moss and leaf litter. Rausch Gap is proof that abandonment doesn't always look like destruction. Sometimes it looks like absence. A workforce disappears. A rail line changes its priorities. The forest takes over. And the only thing left is the shape of what used to matter. Next, we're heading to a place that didn't fade into the woods. It exploded into fame, drew people in by the thousands, and then collapsed almost as fast. Number 2, Pithole City, Venango County. If you want the purest example of the American boom and bust, you won't find it in a skyline. You'll find it in a patch of Pennsylvania woods where a city appeared almost overnight, exploded with money and noise, and then evaporated before most people could even spell its name. It started with oil. In early 1865, wells around Pithole Creek began producing, and word spread the way rumors always spread when there's profit involved. By May of that same year, the town was laid out, streets sketched into the hills as if someone drew a grid on a map and expected reality to obey. And reality did. By the end of 1865, Pithole was incorporated, and estimates put the population around 20,000 people. Think about that, 20,000. In a place that had been nothing but wilderness months earlier. The numbers get even crazier when you look at what the town built to feed the stampede. At least 54 hotels sprang up because everyone needed a bed and nobody planned on leaving soon. There were churches, a newspaper, a theater, and all the businesses that follow a sudden flood of cash. The streets were packed. The energy was manic. Pithole wasn't just a town, it was a fever dream made of lumber, mud, and opportunity. But the kind of city you build in a rush is a city made of thin walls. Pithole's collapse was fast, brutal, and almost mechanical. Oil prices dropped hard, cutting the legs out from under the entire economy. Then technology arrived with perfect timing for the worst possible result. In 1866, a pipeline opened that made it easier to move oil without relying on wagons and teams. That meant the people who were hauling, supplying, and living off the flow of oil suddenly had less work, less money, and less reason to stay. And as if the town needed one more problem, fire kept sweeping through again and again, destroying wells, businesses, and boarding houses. When a place is built quickly, it burns quickly. The decline shows up in cold numbers. By December of 1866, the population had already plunged below 2,000. A few years later, by 1870, you're looking at a place with only a handful of households left and a single hotel still standing. The city that once hosted tens of thousands became a whisper in the trees. That is what makes Pithole so unnerving. It wasn't abandoned over generations. It was abandoned almost in real time. People didn't just move away, they scattered, chasing the next strike, the next boomtown, the next chance to get rich before the ground changed its mind. Today, you can visit the site and see the outline of streets that no longer lead anywhere. The land still remembers where the town stood, even if the buildings don't. Pithole is the kind of place that makes you understand how a city can be temporary, how a whole community can be built on a single resource and vanish the moment the numbers stop working. And now we reach number 1, the town that didn't collapse because money left. It collapsed because something beneath it never stopped burning. Number 1, Centralia, Columbia County. This is not a ghost town in the usual sense because Centralia didn't just empty out. It was driven out by something you can't see, something that doesn't care about seasons, elections, or deadlines. Since 1962, the ground beneath Centralia has been burning, and the town above it has been living on borrowed time ever since. At first, it didn't look like the beginning of the end. A fire started in an area connected to old coal workings, and the danger wasn't obvious from the surface. But underground mine fires don't behave like normal fires. They don't sit politely in one place. They crawl through seams, follow oxygen, and slip into spaces you can't reach with a hose or a bucket. Over time, the heat and the gases turned the town into a question mark. That's the signature image of Centralia. You can have a quiet road, trees, and empty lots, and then you notice the warnings. The land can be unstable. Dangerous gases can collect. In cold weather, people have described seeing steam or smoke leaking up through cracks and patches of snow melting in strange, uneven shapes because the earth is warmer than it should be. It feels like the town itself is breathing. As the years passed, the state faced an impossible choice. Fighting a moving fire underground is expensive and risky, and there is no simple finish line. Instead, officials focused on removing the people from harm. In the 1980s, a buyout and relocation effort pushed most residents to leave. The population dropped, house after house disappeared, and blocks that used to hold families became open ground. Then came the paperwork that made it official. In 1992, the state used eminent domain to take control of the remaining properties. In 2002, the U.S. Postal Service discontinued Centralia's zip code, 17927, a small bureaucratic detail that lands like a punch. When a town loses its zip code, it's not just empty. It's erased from the everyday systems people take for granted. Years later, a deal allowed a handful of remaining residents to stay for the rest of their lives. But by modern census counts, the number of people left has dropped into single digits. For a while, Centralia developed a second life through a strange kind of tourism. Part of the old Route 61 became known as Graffiti Highway, covered in layers of names and bright paint, turning a disaster zone into a photo backdrop. But even that didn't last. The site was eventually covered over and blocked to keep people out, as if the town story was trying to close the door on spectators. Centralia is a place where the danger is not a crumbling building. It's the invisible idea that the ground itself can betray you, a fire that can outlive generations, a town that became a warning sign. And that's why it sits at number 1. Because Centralia isn't just abandoned, it's unfinished. Pennsylvania is full of places that didn't just fade away. They were reshaped by forces bigger than any one town. Industry that moved on, water that rose on schedule, and even fire that never stopped burning. If there's one takeaway from these 10 abandoned places, it's this: a ghost town is rarely just about empty buildings. It's about what happens when a community's lifeline gets cut. Sometimes slowly, sometimes overnight, and sometimes from underneath your feet. Now I want to hear from you. Which location hit you the hardest, and which one would you actually visit if you had the chance? Also, if you know a forgotten town in Pennsylvania that deserves a spot on a future list, drop the name in the comments because I read them all. If you enjoyed this countdown, tap like, subscribe, and check out the next video in the playlist because the next state gets even stranger.